Greetings, my name is Don Bragg, and I am a project leader and research forester with USDA Forest Service's Southern Research Station. My presentation today is about the site survey work I've done over the past couple years on the long-defunct Irons Fork Experimental Forest, located primarily in Polk County, Arkansas. Back in April of 1931, W.G. Wallenberg with U.S. Forest Service's Southern Forest Experiment Station, the predecessor to my research station, issued a report on the suitability of several small watersheds for a possible experimental forest in the Ouachita Mountains of western Arkansas to study forest management practices, otherwise known as silviculture. For various reasons, Wallenberg's team's assessment was not encouraging. While this area was at the time deemed unsuitable for a silviculture-focused experimental forest, the Irons Fork area was okay for one on forest influences, and by 1936 work began on developing such a field station. Approximately 3,630 hectares, or nearly 9,000 acres, of the Ouachita National Forest have been allocated for the Irons Fork Experimental Forest, in a remote area that included the upper Irons Fork Creek drainage and adjoining areas of Irons Fork and Fouche Mountains. Note the crowfly distances to some of the major nearby communities of Mina and Odin. Because I could literally speak for hours on the Irons Fork Experimental Forest, but I can't, I will focus on two areas I site surveyed in 2020 and 2021. The first is the Experimental Forest Administrative Location, hereby using site designation 3PL-1058, which was located at the westernmost corner of the forest along the Odin Irons Fork Truck Trail, which was the best road leading to Mina. The second area of this paper focuses on a collection of sites concentrated around a series of water control structures called weirs in the Hoover and Nesbitt Creek drainages. First, the administrative area. This map was drawn at the very beginning of the administrative site's development, but prior to facility construction. While there was nothing of the administrative site by late 1936, that did not mean that this was an untouched location. It is clear from this map that the site had been previously used as a farmstead, with evidence of house and barn foundations, an abandoned field, and roads. The administrative site grew rapidly over the next several years, thanks to relief workers from the CCC and WPA. By 1940, the administrative site had developed considerably to include a half-dozen structures, fencing, roads, and other infrastructure. We are still trying to determine the exact nature of some of these structures, but some we have good information on. This includes the most visible remnant of the Irons Fork Experimental Forest Administrative Site, the remains of a stone and mortar signpost built in classic CCC style. Note my 1.9 meter tall son Kenny for a sense of scale on the modern photograph on the right. This signpost, as can be seen in the historical photograph on the left, was right on the edge of the Odin Irons Fork Truck Trail, and it had a stacked stone base as well as a wooden sign. Initially, the stone post was all that monumented and was described for 3PL-1058. While the wooden sign is largely gone, it is reportedly in storage on the National Forest. Some decaying wood remains from the log that once held this sign. Another important part of this administrative site was the office and laboratory building. Unfortunately, I've yet to find a historical photograph of this office and lab, but there's a good line drawing of this building, published in a volume on Forest Service architectural styles of this period. This line drawing, shown in various elevations, shows the stone and wood construction typical of CCC-built structures of the time, with some details provided, such as a partial basement, flared external walls, fireplace, plumbing, porch, and office lab space. And here's what remains of this office/lab building today. Regrettably, nothing remains above ground except some parts of the poured concrete foundation, as well as scattered large chunks of wall materials. I did no subsurface testing of any of these sites, so I cannot speak to what might be buried here or elsewhere on the experimental forest. At least one image of perhaps the largest structure to have been built remains. This picture is of the dormitory, built to house workers and visitors to this remote location. Again, note the stone and wood construction typical for CCC-made buildings. The line drawing on the lower right is from a blueprint-style map of the admin site, showing some aspects of the dorm. The double lines are an unfortunate artifact of the line drawing, not some unique architectural style. Note the extension of this dorm, circled in green. I'll get to this shortly. What a spectacular building, if it only survived. As with the office building, today virtually nothing remains of the dorm except the poured concrete foundations. However, we did find another feature we believe to be part of the dorm structure. Kenny is standing next to two openings into a two-chambered concrete tank buried below the ground surface. Given its placement, the green arrow points to its approximate spot, and likely relationship to the extension noted previously, I believe this is probably a septic tank to go with the indoor plumbing of this dorm. One feature we encountered that hadn't been previously documented, surprising since it was located right along the road, puzzled us at first. But then Hope noticed it was located on the blueprint map I had brought along, which showed what appears to be a poured concrete base of a cattle guard, which were used in conjunction with fences to keep cattle from entering an area via a road. The historical picture above shows an example of a different cattle guard from Texas from about this period. Although this is not very easy to see in these pictures from last December, the remaining cattle guard feature is separated in the middle by a poured concrete foundation with threaded bolts sticking up. I believe these threaded bolts held down the wood or metal slats that supported vehicles that would drive over them. Looking at the hillside version of the LiDAR-derived digital elevation model of this administrative site, several other notable features appeared. First, several flattened areas became apparent, including those for some of the buildings that had been constructed, including the office, dorm, and garage buildings. But also, in the top of the image, a leveled area was quite apparent. Our historical records show that this area was cleared and leveled in 1942 to build a custodian's residence. However, it does not appear that this building was ever built because of the closure of the experimental forest due to World War II. Also note the small circular feature shown by the white arrow. I will address this shortly. The blueprint map of this site, developed primarily to show the plans for this residence, clearly shows the location intended for the building. But it also showed this small circular feature without an obvious explanation. However, note its elevated location and proximity to the other buildings. This turned out to be a stone and mortar foundation to a water tank that was built by the CCC to alleviate the admin site's problems with insufficient water supply. This circular water tank base was not noted in the earlier filed site reports, but was included in a later unfiled report. Those reporting this did not have the same files we did, so had no idea what this feature would have been. My boys provide scale for the circular base, as does the measuring tape. This feature is in good condition. There is no sign of the tank that actually held the water, which may have been made of wood or metal. Now for the other part of the site survey project. As I mentioned earlier, this part focused on a series of water control structures and their supporting infrastructure in the Hoover and Nesbitt Creek drainages. Of the 5 sites I'll discuss, only one, 3PL 259, had been documented prior to last December. The rest, from 3PL 1645 to 3PL 1648, are all new site records, and these speak to the intended mission of the Irons Fork Experimental Forest. I will touch upon each of these sites, but focus on the most prominent one, 3PL 1645, highlighted by the red arrow. Starting from east to west, 3PL 1648 is one of the small concrete and stone weirs that span the channel of East Branch of Hoover Creek. As you can see from the historical photograph of this weir when operated, a small concrete and stone structure was built on top of the stone outcrop that spanned the channel. This stone outcrop helped limit the subsurface flow of water to improve the accuracy of the water flow estimates. Water flowed through the weir, which had been calibrated using the notch and a measuring gauge housed in the adjacent white equipment box. Note the metal cylinder that helped protect the equipment. This still remains, crumpled but in situ. Unfortunately, high flow events since the work ceased have washed away most of the weir and stone riprap along the channel. The west branch of Hoover Creek had a similarly designed weir, as is apparent in the historical photograph. As with the previous site, 3PL 1647 has also lost most of the weir and rock riprap following high stream flow events. The metal angle iron post that helped anchor the gauging equipment remains, but the metal cylinder has washed several hundred meters downstream. There was also a small concrete-lined pit on the west side of the channel. I do not know the purpose of this pit. 3PL 1646 is one of the most incomplete gauging locations on the Irons Fork. Some of the documentation, primarily an early map, had temporary weirs on some of the smaller tributaries to the Hoover and Nesbitt Creeks, and this appears to be one of those sites. No evidence of a concrete weir remains, only the rock riprap to anchor the stream channels. Whether this weir was under construction or completed and then washed away is unclear, at least with the current evidence. 3PL 259 is the first site apparently documented for the Irons Fork Experimental Forest. When originally recorded back in the 1990s, the Forest Service archaeologist who documented the site thought it might have been the headquarters of the experimental forest. It was not. There was evidence recorded then of a collapsed structure, with likely locations of pilings and other indications of construction. Additionally, a number of metal, glass, and even rubber artifacts were strewn about the site. My revisit in December 2020 found the site largely undisturbed and mostly as described. These photographs show some of the more obvious artifacts, some of which are quite apparent, such as a crushed Indian brand water tank, a length of rubber hose, and a pile of pint milk bottles. These pint milk bottles are some of the more intriguing artifacts. The original site surveyor thought they might have been part of a rainfall chemistry experiment, but I found no evidence of such research in the archival materials. Rather, I believe these milk bottles, which have faded markings, including numbers painted on them, were actually part of a water sediment measuring device. Such a device, an Anderson-Einstein sampler, was described in a 1940 government report on ways to sample sediments in flowing streams. This particular sampler was suggested for small streams, such as those found on the Irons Fork, and could be quickly and cheaply constructed. I also heard a story that these bottles were provided by local school children. Given that the fact that this pile probably has scores of such bottles, that story seems very plausible. 3PL 1645 is by far the largest and most complex of the weir sites that I have found on the Irons Fork Experimental Forest. The historical map on the upper left shows two gauging points, weir locations, and their code numbers, as well as the presence of a shack or shelter, which the staff used when working at this remote location. I have also added the locations of two other sites, 3PL 259 and 3PL 1646, for perspective. It is interesting in my mind that only 3PL 259 had been recorded prior to this last year, especially when the scale of 3PL 1645, shown on the lower right hillshade base map, defined by the light green area. 3PL 1645 is a complex of large and small weirs, a road network, a structural remnant, and what appears to be a series of borrow pits. On West Nesbitt Creek, gauging station number 1, we have photographs of the construction of the big weir. This large weir, following an established research design called a Columbus deep notch, took at least 900 bags of concrete to complete, and was built by a CCC crew in 1942, surprisingly late for the CCC, given that we were already at war. Notice how much larger this Columbus deep notch weir was compared to the much smaller original concrete and stone weir indicated by the arrows in the top left picture. Also note how much more complicated the overall structure was, as shown in the lower right photograph. The Forest Service intended for all their weirs on the Irons Fork to be of this size and design, but a lack of resources and the war kept that from happening. The size and strength of this design meant that it has survived the decades quite well compared to smaller concrete and stone weirs. These pictures were taken in December of 2020 and show little evidence of structural failure or vandalism. A Columbus deep notch weir, with its large notch for extreme flow events and smaller V-shaped notch for more typical flows, was designed to work in streams in this kind of environment, which typically had limited water except following heavy precipitation events. The bronze notch blade was designed to ensure accuracy in flow measurements and to resist erosion. Behind the weir, a couple basins help regulate the water flow and capture floating debris such as logs that may damage the equipment. These large weirs used a device called a stilling well to ensure accuracy in the measurement of the water level and stream flow. A basic design for such a stilling well is shown in the diagram in the upper right. Water flows from the basin via pipes into the stilling well, where a float rises or falls with changes to the water level. The stilling well limits the turbulence caused by the stream flow, thereby improving the consistency of the water level recorded. 3PL 1645 had such a device, visible by the concrete structure Kenny is standing next to. In addition to the placement of the stilling well, white arrow in the lower right picture, you can also see the reference bar and other gauging equipment near where my family is sitting. Several piles of building debris appear to be all that remains of what had been variously described a shack or shelter. This structure, nestled at the bottom of a hill slope between the two drainages, may have been moved to this position from 3PL 259, which was only a few hundred meters downstream. The building likely built at 3PL 259 was described in the archives as a portable structure and would have been small enough to move. Gauging station number 2 on the east branch of Nesbitt Creek was the original concrete and stone design. Although the concrete and stone weir and metal cylinder have been substantially impacted by high flow events, the stone riprap of this weir site is in very good shape, as these pictures make apparent. A series of round to elliptical pits about 1 meter in depth and up to several meters long were located on the flat eastern bank of this site, as seen in the upper right image. It seems likely that these pits were dug to provide the stone used for the riprap, as they do not appear to have any other experimental use. This concludes my presentation on the site survey work I've done to date on the Irons Fork Experimental Forest, although there's still a lot of survey and archaeology still possible. This series of historical photographs show some of the other experimental work that was done on the forest that may still have an archaeological footprint. From the water diversion structures, such as the one being studied in the upper left image, to locations for the weather stations, top right image, to other runoff sampling devices, lower images, opportunities abound. Unfortunately, these experimental areas are not as well documented and may have little obvious footprint to record. Perhaps some of the most interesting information that could come from the Irons Fork Experimental Forest area may be related to the trees. Much of this area has remained either old growth or partially cut old growth, and hence retains many old trees. This includes an abundance of shortleaf pine that is probably 200 to 300 years old, or perhaps even older, and remnant deadwood, such as the shortleaf pine stump, that could be used to study both the long-term climate of this area, as well as the fire history of this location, recorded in scars to the wood. These fires were most likely set by people, and hence could help document Native American and early settler burning practices in this area, perhaps into the 1700s. I hope you found this presentation useful, and I look forward to any questions you may have about this work or the Irons Fork Experimental Forest. You are welcome to contact me via email as well. My address is in the upper right corner of the slide. Thank you for your attention.